Okay, all right. First, let's do a bit of a comparison, which is absolutely necessary to put everything in context. Even though lowland Susiana geologically is an extension of the Mesopotamian plain, its geography, climate, and hydrology are different and played a major role in its socioeconomic development. These factors, as well as that of demography, which I will discuss later, seem to have been primarily responsible for the major differences in the cultural trajectory of Susiana compared to that of southern Mesopotamia. Susiana is surrounded by mountains from north and west and northeast. The width of the plain can be crossed in half a day on foot. This proximity also provides easy access from the mountains to the plain. In comparison, in a straight line, the distance between Uruk and the mountains to the east is about 250 kilometers. From Susa, 45, and from Chohamish is about 20 kilometers. The seasonal temperatures are much lower than in southern Mesopotamia, and the annual precipitation is much higher. Now, this is a slide of many years of rainfall precipitation in northern Khuzestan. You see the lowest that we have is 176 millimeter, and the highest is 705 millimeters, but the average is about between 350 and 400. This allows for extensive dry farming, which until recently was a still practice in the northern sectors of the plain. In comparison, dry farming was impossible in lower Mesopotamia, at least from the 4th millennium BC. It's not therefore surprising that even before Khuzestan was subjected to drastic physical changes as a result of the agribusiness projects, and no traces of major pre-Sassanian irrigation canals could be found. Before the introduction of modern canal irrigation technology, the center of the plain was crisscrossed by many small natural streams that could be easily tapped for a small scale irrigation. In the upper Susiana plain, the pebbly soil is fed by underground springs and high water table from the seepage of the Karkhe and the Dez rivers that make the area ideal for dry farming. In fact, the river Shaur originates some 20 kilometers north of Susa from many small and large springs on the east bank of the Karkhe. In the eastern sector of the plain, before the land was broken by numerous wadis that today mark the landscape, seasonal floodwaters were distributed widely across the area, making the practice of recessional farming possible. In such a landscape, unlike southern Mesopotamia, there could not have been a fierce competition between upstream and downstream irrigators, which Adams considered as a major source of conflict and perhaps a practical reason for the development of urban life and fortified cities as an adaptive measure against the uncertain conditions of farming. The gradient in upper Susiana is much steeper than in lower Mesopotamia, and therefore salinization, especially in the central and western part of the region, is not and may not have been a problem. No permanent or seasonal marshes exist in upper Susiana, but in the lower part, south of the Haftepe anticline, vast areas become seasonally inundated, and when dried in summer, a layer of salt covers the dried bottoms of these marshes. The natural topography of agriculture may be as much a determinant of the size of centers as their functions. Therefore, the settlements in southern Mesopotamia, dependent for their subsistence on irrigation waters, tend to agglomerate near those rivers and irrigation canals. Sites in northern Susiana, as we will see, are spread out to maximize the agricultural potentials of the environment. Now, when we talk about urbanism and urban centers in Susiana, we need to consider the question of scale, as you can see here in this slide, in terms of regional, aggregate, and individual settlement size. A number of researchers divide Susiana settlements into city, town, small centers, and villages. But in comparison with southern Mesopotamia, with real urban landscape, late 4th millennium Susa and Shohamish would be considered as large villages or even small towns. Hans Nissen, many years ago, mentioned this problem in characterizing Susiana as an urban civilization. If we assume the size and therefore number of inhabitants of population centers determine the level of stress and internal conflicts, and of course, the level of conflict regulation, the level of overall social and economic organization must have been vastly different in a 15 to 20 hectare centers such as Susa and Shohamish than that of 100 hectares of Uruk in the late 4th millennium BC. By the early dynastic period, Uruk with 400 hectares was the largest city in the entire world. In Iran, until about late 3rd millennium BC, there was no city larger than 80 hectares. Those that reached this size are few and far away from one another, namely Susa, Malian, perhaps Konar Sandal, and Shahr Sukhte. Nevertheless, cities must be defined in terms of their functional size more than in their physical or population size. And functional size is the agglomerations of different activities in a settlement, especially when those activities are not produced elsewhere in its polity. Now, with this long introduction, let me now begin with the pre-urban settlement system of the 5th millennium BC and proceed to later periods. This is necessary because, as we will see, the settlement system that will be described in the following periods was established at the end of the Middle Susiana around 4700 BC and endured until the end of Sasanian times. This actually, this graph shows a huge difference between urban centers and agglomerated settlement system with Susiana and the Kur River Basin. Now, the Middle Susiana period reached the highest population increase in Susiana, with Shohamish as the largest population center on the plain with about 15 hectares and some 2,500 to 3,000 inhabitants, and a monumental building. This period followed by late Susiana I, or Farrokh phase as it's known in Dehloran. This phase is characterized by a style of pottery known as dot motif, where the main element of design is surrounded by numerous decorative dots. For the first time, this prehistoric pottery appeared in much of the central Zagros Mountains, as well as in the plains of Dehloran, Rahmormuz, Behbahan, and the Kur River Basin, replacing the local pottery tradition. This event also coincides with the appearance of the isolated cemeteries of Hakalan and Parchine, dating to 4700 to 4500 BC, with tomb structures found in the numerous Bronze and Iron Age Zagros cemeteries that Vandenberg excavated. In this slide, you see the lower one is when the Middle Susiana period, when Susiana was populated and Shohamish was the only major center on the plain. The upper one, as you see, is right after the Middle Susiana period, that dot motif period, when most of the settlements in the eastern sectors are abandoned, including Shohamish, and moved to the western sector of the plain. In Susiana, this pottery does not exist at Chogamish, and many of its satellites in eastern Susiana for the reason I just showed you. This phase of abandonment of Chogamish and most of its satellites in the sector is marked by the burning of the Chogamish monumental building. In any case, Chogamish was reoccupied in the following late Susiana II or Susa A or 1 phase, but was abandoned again and was not reoccupied until the middle of the Susa II or Middle Uruk phase. Susa is primarily known to have been founded at the end of the late Susiana I phase, that is around 4500 BC. In OIP 130 in 2008, I suggested that Susa was founded by Chogamish diaspora based on the several pieces of LS1 or dot motif painted pottery published by Esteve and Gash. But the context of those pieces were not known. 2 years ago, the staff of Susa Chateau excavated two trenches at the base of the Susa mud brick platform to test this idea and to explore the level of virgin soil in that area. In trench 2, below the erosion deposit, 70 centimeters of settlement was reached that was devoid of any archaeological deposit. It was this layer that the excavators of Susa considered virgin soil. The trench was continued deeper, and below the sedimentary deposit, a Pise wall and archaeological layers containing typical dot motif pottery were reached, as you see here. These are the example of that pottery. So we have now good evidence that the founding of Susa was earlier, around 4700 BC, and that its foundation followed very soon after the abandonment of Chogamish. These events around 4700 BC resulted in a built landscape in Susiana that was maintained for millennia. I will offer some speculations on the causes of such transformations later. In Susiana, this pottery doesn't exist at Chogamish and many of its satellites in Susiana. This phase of abandonment of Chogamish, During the Susa A phase, Susa, covering about 10 hectares, was the largest center, 5 times larger than any other site, a position and size similar to Chogamish before its abandonment. Most of the population lived in 40 or more smaller settlements. Unlike the previous phase, when every surrounding intermountain valleys was populated, Susa and its satellites were seemingly virtually alone. At some point, a massive mud brick platform was built and crowned by major structures, presumably a temple, was with associated personnel and a high priest, as suggested in this remarkable seal impression from Susa. This is really an incredible piece of evidence. What you see is the man in the center, much bigger than everybody else. And there is another person, presumably half naked, behind him, but depicted in a smaller size. And then there are these prostrating figures around it. Now, whether this is really a high priest or a political leader, it doesn't really matter. It's just, we know that the line between religion and politics is very, very thin. And that can be just maybe a priest ruler at Susa at that time. The original status of Susa as the administrative and cult center endured for millennia. As was the case with Chogamish, this monumental building was burned and presumably its victims were buried in a large cemetery at the foot of the platform. This event, the burning of Susa platform, may not have been isolated, since our excavation at KS4 or Chogadosar, revealed a contemporary burnt mud brick platform at the summit of the site. So this violent event in Susiana may not have been confined to Susa alone. During the next phase, terminal Susa A, it is marked by its pronounced low-density settlements. 17 sites are identified scattered around the plain, primarily between the Ojirub and Dez and Karkhe. This phase is poorly understood and even recognized in surface survey. Around 4000 BC, conflict may have resulted in collapse of Susa A system. Susa was reduced to some 5 hectares and most of the villages were abandoned. Similar collapse occurred in Ram Hormuz and Dehloran, where Musian, its largest center, and its satellite villages were abandoned. We may speculate about the causes of this systemic collapse, but shortage of agricultural land and food stress or climatic change could not be among them. But the disappearance of the elaborate painted pottery that most probably was the medium of expression of the social position belies fundamental problems in social organization, which we can only guess. The beginning of early Susa II or early Uruk period is poorly known both in Susiana and throughout greater Mesopotamia. The total occupation area is estimated about 95 hectares, and Susa with about 10 to 12 hectares still dominates the plain. The built landscape in eastern and northern plain is preserved in this phase as well. The following Middle Susiana, Middle Susa II or Middle Uruk period, Susa expanded to about 25 hectares, developing a large lower town, Chogamish with about 17 hectares and Abu Fandove with about 10 hectares developed similar division. In all 3 centers, there is evidence of crafts production in lower areas and more elaborate non-residential architecture on the higher portions. Susiana reached its largest settlement system since 5th millennium BC. Administrative technology fully developed in all these 3 regional centers, but their relations is a matter of speculation. The number of small settlements increased, but the eastern and northern sectors remained unoccupied. In the next phase, the late Susa II or late Uruk period, Susa, Chogamish, and Abu Fandove, the 3 regional centers continued into this phase, but there is a drop in the number of small sites around these centers. Now, you can see that the fluctuation of the settlement numbers and aggregates from terminal Susa 8 all the way to the late Uruk period in Susiana. Now, during the Susa III or Proto-Literate period, drastic changes take place by late 4th millennium BC. Chogamish once more was abandoned, and the eastern and northern sectors are completely devoid of settlement. There are also indications of increased transhumance and nomadism throughout the mountains in post-4th millennium BC. Material culture at Susa exhibits highland tradition. It has been speculated that there was a break in the sequence between Acropole level 17, which is late Uruk, and 16, which is Proto-Elamite. But this may will be a local event, as our excavations at Abu Fandove showed no break between late Uruk and Proto-Elamite deposits. Moreover, examples of typical Proto-Elamite painted pottery are found in level 17, as you see here. The complex Proto-Elamite script and its glyptic art could not have developed so rapidly anywhere outside the Susiana tradition. The settlement pattern, number of sites, and their sizes are controversial in this phase. Based on the list of 35 sites given to John Alden by White, he succeeded to visit only 29 sites, but did not find characteristic shares of Susa III period on 10 of them. Alden considers Susa as the only large center, KS 38 and KS 396 as two small sites in the upper Susiana, and the other settlements as minor sites. Schacht estimated 30 hectares for Susa during this time, whereas Alden suggested only 11 hectares for each phases of Susa III period. Schacht believed Tepe Sanjar, KS7, with 12 hectares, is the other major site in the sector. But Alden did not see any Susa III shares on this site. Sardari, who excavated Tepe Sanjar, revealed a very small settlement of this period, about 1 hectare. But perhaps that was because of the limited excavation that he had on the site. Let's see. As you see, most of the very small sites are bunched together in the area between the Ojirub and Lore, presumably for security reasons. The rest of the plain is almost empty space, except for the very small Tepe Sanjar in the north, and the built landscape of the previous phase is maintained. The sophistication and geographic reach of the Proto-Elamite civilization cast doubt on a systematic collapse of the 4th millennium BC, Susiana polity. Moreover, the nature of the administrative tablets from Susa that record large amounts of grain and dairy products and large number of animals is not commensurate with the seemingly empty landscape of Susiana in this phase. The next phase, early dynastic Akkadian. The real collapse in the system occurred around 2800 BC, just as the various city-states were rapidly developing in southern Mesopotamia at the beginning of the early dynastic period. We do not know much about the events in Susiana after the collapse of the Proto-Elamite civilization and its enclaves on the plateau. The shared painted pottery in the various highland cemeteries, as well as those from Dehloran, from Hormuz and Susa, indicate the continuous lowland-highland ties, as well as the decline of urban landscape that already started with the Proto-Elamite period. By the time of early dynastic III, a great network of trade across the Iranian plateau involving Mesopotamia, Persian Gulf Coast, Kerman, Central Asia, and Indus Valley focused the attention of Mesopotamian city-states and later the Akkadian and Sumerian kings on the various highland polities who controlled the trade routes. By the time of early dynastic Akkadian, Susa grew to about 46 hectares. There were 32 sites ranging from 0.2 to 0.7 hectares, very small. Shah gravity model suggests small interaction between few sites around Chohapan and Susa. The rest were isolated. In fact, Susa itself seems to be isolated. There are some important places named in the Akkadian sources, such as Adamdon, Hupsana, and Zahara. Adamdon is identified with Deheno, or somewhere near Shushtar. Tepe Charma, between Andimeshk and Desful, with about 4 hectare size, is suggested, and even Tepe Musian in the Dehloran region, or somewhere in the central Zagros, as suggested by Vala as representing Awan, but we really don't know where Awan is. As for Zahar, the only candidate in Susiana is Tepe Sanjar, that at time was much bigger than a village. Regardless of where these various polities or towns were located in or around Susiana, what is important is the underlying picture of disunity in the lowlands where they existed presumably as autonomous entities not subordinate to Susa. Now, you can see that similar trends that we witnessed in Susiana also occurred in Dehloran. And I don't have the graph for Ram Hormuz, but similar settlement pattern and decline and rise of the population centers occurred in that region as well. Collapse of the Akkadian dynasty and the rise of the Shimashki population centers in Susiana show a higher level of interactions, although Susa, Adamdon, and Awan, wherever it is, are treated in Urtri records as distinct and independent entities with their own rulers. Again, except for Susa, Chogapan, Deheno, and Tapesanjar, the rest of the settlements are very small and scattered on the plain. In the following Sukalmach period, it's a period of population growth in Susiana. For the first time, 8 large population centers exist simultaneously on the plain. Susa grew to about 85 hectares, but the overall morphology of the settlement system remains the same. That is, the northern and eastern sectors of the plain is sparsely populated. Several new settlements were established in the southwestern sector, presumably because of the development of the Shaur canal system. Following this period is the middle Elamite period that is divided into 2 phases, Middle Elamite 1 and Middle Elamite 2. Middle Elamite 1 is the time of Haftape, or some call it Haftape phase. The rise of Haftape and the diminish of Susa represent Middle Elamite 1 or Haftape transitional phase. Haftape with about 30 hectares became prominent, while Susa shrank to about 55 hectares. Chogapan with 20 hectares, Qale Bangun with 11 hectares, Sanjar with 13, and Charma and Deheno with about 9 hectares each were the major population centers on the plain. Nevertheless, the settlement system morphology did not change from the previous phase, when the main interaction network is in the southwest and the central sectors. Middle Elamite 2, which is about 1300 to 1000 BC, is a phase that coincides with the height of Elamite political, social, and economic power. Many small villages were abandoned in this phase, presumably absorbed by larger centers. Chogazambil, about 100 hectares, was established on the Haftape anticline. Susa grew to about 85 hectares again, and Haftape was diminished. The regional centers that had been established before reached their peak settlement size, and the new one at Shushtar was established during this phase. The demise of Elam as a primarily a highland federal state coincided with the penetration of the Iranian tribes into the Zagros Mountains in the Iron Age. During the Neo-Elamite I phase, all previous major centers were either abandoned or severely reduced. Susa is still the largest center, with 20 sites scattered primarily on the central sector of the plain. After Susa, Tapesanjar and Chogapan with about 10 hectares are the largest settlement. While Susa and Sanjar seem to be somewhat isolated, Chogapan is surrounded by small villages. A drastic reduction in the number of settlements occurred in the following Neo-Elamite II phase. The plain seems to be almost empty. Typical parity of this phase was found on only 6 sites. Most of the settlements are small, except for KS 369 with 12 hectares, which may have been surrounded by a fortification, as Mirosheji reports. The hostilities between Assyria and Elam surely contributed to this drastic change on the plain. The most surprising and unexpected settlement pattern in Susiana is that of Achaemenid period. Considering that Susa was one of the major Achaemenid capitals, except for Susa, the rest of the settlements are small and scattered around the plain. Only the center of the plain shows a cluster. Susa is all by itself, and the northern and eastern sectors are still devoid of settlements. This map that you're showing now represents the sites Miroshiji identified for the Achaemenid period. But this one, produced by Wenke, is drastically different. Although the settlement topography and the spatial distribution of the sites is the same. The difference between the two maps arises from the uncertainty in the identification of typical Achaemenid ceramics in Khuzestan, and the ceramics found on the sites and attributed to this phase are not comparable to those found at Susa or Choghamish. Miroshiji dated 23 sites to this phase. Wenke attributed more than 50 settlements to this phase, but Miroshiji and Boucherla argued, and Wenke accepted, that his map included a number of Neo-Elamite sites in his Achaemenid settlement patterns. The next phase, the Seleucid period, the identification of the sites is based on the ceramics found in level 3 DC of Ville Royale 2. 20 sites have been dated to this phase. Apart from Susa, only two others, Tape, Gelega, and KS 316, were sizable settlements. Miroshiji reports of a fortification wall around KS 316. The topography of the settlement did not change much during this phase as well, and most of the sites are clustered in the middle of the plain. The Parthian and later Sasanian period saw a drastic change in the settlement patterns. As you see, the number of sites rapidly increased in an unprecedented fashion. Many new and small and large villages, as well as towns established on the plain, especially during the Sasanian period. This demographic and settlement increase is attributed by Wenke to the heavy imperial investment by the Parthian and later Sasanian empires. Even so, the northern and fertile eastern sectors of the plain lack settlements, as you see here, even in the Parthian and Sasanian period, with many sites and small villages. Both Miroshiji and Shasht attributed the Shimashki and Sukalmach settlement patterns to the association between the principal urban centers and powerful nomadic chieftains. But I would like to argue that this balance of power and settlement pattern began with the earliest archaeological evidence of the development of pastoral nomadism in North and the Northwestern Susiana, and gave rise to the asymmetrical settlement pattern that we see throughout the history of the plain. The influence of the nomadic element in eastern and northern sectors of the plain suppressed the development of large number of villages and especially urban centers. The long history of the settlement topography in Susiana shows that once established, it became durable and lasted, at least in Susiana until the Parthian and Sasanian period. While the Proto-Elamite period is hailed as the first manifestation of the lowland-highland sphere of interaction, as Proto-Elamite pottery, glyptic, and even architectural features are found in both regions. The earliest manifestation was during the late Susiana I or Farrokh phase, as we discussed earlier. The settlement pattern that we observed in Susiana from the 5th millennium BC until the end of the Sasanian times may reflect the specific ecological and environmental features of Susiana and the interaction between the lowland Susiana and the highlands, which Miroshiji called the Elamite system, though he did not include late prehistoric in this system. As I argued in my current anthropology paper, so did Miroshiji in his Yeki Nabud یکی نبود article, the book dedicated to William Sumner. This was maintained for millennia through the imperative of the control of winter pastures, complementarity of agriculture and pastoral economies, and the kinship ties. The political system of the Elamite as a type of Bundesrepublik may also reflect such highland-lowland relation and interaction. Northern Susiana was typically the winter pasture of the Faili lords of the Pushtuku, while eastern sector of the plain was and still to a small degree is the heart of the winter pasture land of the Bakhtiari tribes. And compared with the lands west of the Lore River, ancient villages here are rare, as are modern day villages. While animal husbandry and farming are complementary, cultivation in pastoralist territories is detrimental to their way of life and would lead to hostilities. Obviously, there were no Bakhtiari or Faili lords until historical periods. The archaeological evidence for the development of mobile pastoralism appears in the 5th millennium in the number of shallow campsites in the Shahrikord region, isolated cemeteries of Akalan and Parchine, and the later Bronze and Iron Age cemeteries discovered by Vandenberg in the highlands. This subsistent economy requires winter and summer pasture lands to be viable. The winter pastures, by necessity, are located in southwestern Iran, consisting of Dehloran, Ram Hormuz, Behbahan, and eastern and northern parts of Khuzestan. While this picture may seem simplified in explaining the millennia-old built landscape in Susiana, given the data I marshaled here, I cannot think of any other factors that were major contributors to this pattern. I will end my presentation by a quote from Bob Adams. In 1961, when archaeological and morphological evidence from Khuzestan was much more limited, Adams astutely observed that Elamite military prowess did not derive from a large, densely settled peasantry occupying irrigated lowlands in what is often loosely considered the heart of Iran. Instead, the enclave around Susa must have been merely one component in a more heterogeneous and loosely structured grouping of factors. I would like to thank you, everybody, and wish you happy Nowruz and a wonderful and healthy New Year for all of you.